On January 19, 2010, a woman named Grace Groner died in a one-bedroom cottage in Lake Forest, Illinois. She was 100 years old. She had never owned a car. She walked to the grocery store, walked to church, and walked to the college campus a few blocks from her front door. Most of what hung in her closet had been bought secondhand at rummage sales. Her neighbors knew her as cheerful, generous, endlessly interested in other people, and entirely unremarkable. When the attorneys finished counting what she left behind, the number came to just over $7 million. To understand how strange that sentence is, you have to understand where she lived. Lake Forest is one of the wealthiest towns in the United States. Lakefront estates, private drives, stone gateposts, Chicago money that has been old money for more than a century. And for the last 30 years of her life, one of the richest people in that town was a retired secretary in a small cottage, wearing a coat somebody else had donated. Nobody knew, not her neighbors, not her church, not the college she had graduated from in 1931, which was about to receive the largest gift in its history from a woman who had never once mentioned she had money. Grace Groner never earned more than a modest secretary's wage. She had no inheritance. She never started a business. She never bought property as an investment. She never picked a second stock. Everything she left behind grew out of one decision she made in 1935, and out of a single instruction she left running, untouched, for the next 75 years. Three things had to be true for this to work. Only one of them has anything to do with money. Grace was born in 1909 on a farm in rural Lake County, Illinois, alongside a twin sister named Gladys. It was a small life by design. Wood stove, well water, chores before school. The kind of childhood where the horizon was measured in miles rather than ambitions. Then, when the girls were 12, both of their parents died. Two orphan farm girls in 1921 had almost no path forward. There was no safety net to catch them. In most versions of this story, Grace and Gladys are absorbed into a relative's household, put to work, and never heard from again. That is not what happened. A Lake Forest man named George Anderson, a friend of their parents, and a person of some standing in the community, took both girls in. He gave them a home, and then he did something that reshaped the rest of Grace's century. He paid for both of them to attend Lake Forest College. Hold on to that, because it is the hinge the entire story turns on. Somebody wrote a check so that a 12-year-old orphan could get an education she could never have afforded. Grace graduated in 1931. The timing was catastrophic. The Great Depression was not beginning, it was deepening. 1 in 4 American workers had no job. Banks were failing in waves. Families who had been comfortable in 1928 were selling the dining room furniture to buy flour. Grace walked into that economy with a diploma and no connections, and within months, she did something that thousands of men with more experience could not do. She found work. Abbott Laboratories, a pharmaceutical company in North Chicago, hired her as a secretary. She was 22 years old. She would stay for 43 years. 4 years into that job, in 1935, Abbott offered employees a special issue of company stock at $60 a share. Grace bought 3 of them, $180. It is worth sitting with what that number actually meant in 1935. The average American worker earned somewhere under $1,500 a year. So $180 was not spare change scraped off the top of a comfortable salary. It was well over a month of her income, saved in an economy where a third of the country was one missed paycheck from disaster. And she handed it to the stock market. Remember what the stock market looked like to an ordinary person in 1935. It was 6 years after the crash that had wiped out a generation of savings. It was the thing that had taken people's houses. Buying stock in 1935 was not the safe, obvious index fund default it is today. To most Americans, it was closer to setting money on fire. Grace did it anyway, and the reason is less mysterious than it sounds. She worked at Abbott. She saw the mail, the orders, the research, the shipping volume. She had a view of that company that no broker in Chicago had. She believed it would be there in 20 years. But here is the part that matters, and it is the part almost every retelling of this story rushes past. Buying the shares was not the decision that made her rich. The decision that made her rich was what she did every quarter for the next 75 years. She never sold, not once. And every single time Abbott paid a dividend, Grace took that payment and used it to buy more Abbott stock. Not part of it, all of it, every quarter, for 3/4 of a century. That's it. That's the mechanism. It has a name: dividend reinvestment. And it is not a secret, not a loophole, and not something you need a license or an advisor or a minimum balance to access. But the word compounding has been repeated so many times in so many personal finance books that most people have gone numb to it. So let's make it physical. In 1935, Grace owns 3 shares. Those 3 shares pay a small dividend, a few dollars. That few dollars buys a fraction of a 4th share. Next quarter, slightly more than 3 shares are paying. The dividend is a few cents larger. It buys a slightly larger fraction. Nothing about this is exciting. For years, nothing about this is even visible. If Grace had checked her position in 1940, she would have found a modest holding worth a few $100s. The kind of thing a cautious secretary might own, and nothing more. But the shares are now producing shares, and those shares produce shares. And Abbott, over the decades, splits its stock again and again as the company grows, multiplying her share count each time. The curve is nearly flat for the first 20 years. It is interesting by the mid-1960s. It is genuinely surprising by 1980. And in the final stretch, it goes close to vertical, because by then, the dividends alone are buying hundreds of shares a quarter, and each one of those immediately joins the machine. By the time Grace died in 2010, those 3 shares had become more than 100,000 shares of Abbott Laboratories, worth roughly $7.2 million. She never added new money after that first $180. She never traded. She never rebalanced. She never moved into gold when the experts said to move into gold. She just refused to interrupt it. Which raises the obvious question. If the method is this simple, and this public, and this well documented, why does almost nobody actually do it? The answer is not in the math. The math is trivial. The answer is in what those 75 years actually felt like to live through. Picture the middle decades. Grace is in her 40s, then her 50s. She is typing correspondence at a desk in North Chicago. Once a quarter, a statement arrives, and the number on it is a little larger than the last one. Not dramatically, not enough to change a single thing about her Tuesday. There is no moment of triumph anywhere in this. There is no year where it becomes obvious she is winning. There is just a slightly bigger number, 4 times a year, for 4,000 consecutive weeks, while the rest of the world gets on with more interesting things. Now add the noise on top of that silence. Grace held that position through the crash of 1937, through World War II, through the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the assassination of a president, through the brutal bear market of 1973 and 74, when American stocks lost nearly half their value, through Black Monday in 1987, when the market dropped more than 20% in a single day, through the dot-com collapse, and through 2008, when she was 99 years old and watched roughly 40% of the market's value evaporate in a matter of months. That is more than a dozen separate, fully justified, entirely reasonable moments to sell. Every one of them came with expert commentary explaining exactly why selling was the responsible thing to do. Every one of them would have felt, at the time, like prudence. And every one of them would have ended the story. Now add the second pressure, the quieter one. Somewhere in the 1970s or 80s, Grace Groner became a millionaire on paper. She was living in a 1-bedroom cottage that a friend had left her in a will. She was walking to the store. She was buying dresses at church rummage sales. She could have stopped. She had, by any ordinary measure, won. She could have bought the house, taken the trips, joined the club, and still died comfortable. She didn't. Not because she was punishing herself. And this is where people misread her. By every account from those who knew her, Grace was warm, social, funny, and curious about everyone she met. She traveled. She had friends across generations. She was not a hoarder shivering in the dark next to a pile of stock certificates. She simply had no interest in the things that money is usually spent proving. Economists have a name for the thing she was immune to: lifestyle inflation. It is the near-universal tendency for spending to rise automatically to meet income. Give a person a raise, and within about 18 months, their expenses have quietly expanded to absorb it. This is why someone earning $400,000 a year often saves roughly the same percentage as someone earning $40,000. The dollar amounts differ enormously. The behavior is identical. Grace broke that pattern for 75 consecutive years, and she managed it for a reason that has almost nothing to do with discipline. She already knew what the money was for. Pull back from the details for a moment, because underneath the frugality and the stock certificates, there is one idea, and it is the reason this story keeps getting told. Compounding is not a math problem. It is a time problem. The formula is available to everyone. The returns are available to everyone. The only input that cannot be bought, borrowed, accelerated, or optimized is duration. And duration is the only variable that actually matters. Grace did not outperform Wall Street. Over 75 years, Abbott was a good company, not a miraculous one. What she did was give an ordinary rate of return an extraordinary amount of runway. This is why the wealthiest investor of the modern era, Warren Buffett, has said plainly that the overwhelming majority of his own fortune arrived after his 50th birthday, not because he got better at investing in his 50s, but because that is simply when the curve he had started in his 20s finally became visible. Grace Groner and Warren Buffett were running the same experiment. She just never told anyone she was running it. Which leads to the uncomfortable second half of that idea. There is no business model in patience. Nobody earns a commission on buy it, reinvest the dividends, and do nothing for 75 years. No advisor can bill for it. No brokerage can build a trading app around it. No cable channel can fill 12 hours of programming a day with it. So the entire industry that surrounds your money is structurally required to sell you the opposite: activity, rotation, repositioning, getting out before the drop and back in before the rally. Activity feels like control. Compounding requires you to give control up and let time do work you cannot see happening. And that is the real reason Grace Groner is a story instead of a strategy. What she did was not difficult to understand. It was difficult to leave alone. But there is one more layer here, and it's the one that explains the whole thing. Grace was not saving. She was aiming. Go back to 1921, 2 orphan girls, and a man named George Anderson who paid for an education they could never have bought themselves. Grace spent her entire adult life knowing precisely what that had been worth to her, and precisely what it would have cost her to go without it. So the frugality was never sacrifice. It was arithmetic in service of a target she had set decades before anyone knew she had one. Every dress she didn't buy was another fraction of a share. Every share was another student who would get what she got. She left all of it, the $7 million and the cottage, to Lake Forest College. The money became the Grace Elizabeth Groner Foundation, which pays for Lake Forest students to study abroad, take unpaid internships, and do service work they otherwise could not afford. Not scholarships in the abstract sense, the specific, practical, life-redirecting kind of help that Grace herself had once received from one man's checkbook. And the little house became Grace's cottage, where 2 Lake Forest College seniors are invited to live each year. Which brings us back to where we started. A 100-year-old woman in a second-hand coat, walking to church in one of the richest towns in America, quietly holding a fortune that nobody in her life ever suspected. She was never on a rich list. She never gave a speech, wrote a book, or told anyone what she had done. She bought 3 shares of stock in 1935 for $180, refused to touch them for 75 years, and then gave every dollar away to strangers who will never meet her. More than 16 years after her death, her money is still working, still sending students overseas, still paying for the first month of somebody's unpaid internship, still compounding in the only way she ever cared about. If you want to learn more about building your own financial story, the link is in the description. And if this one stayed with you, subscribe. There's a new money story every